Hello, and welcome to this quick overview of America in World War II, focusing on America's industrial output during the period before Pearl Harbor and then actual military intervention afterwards. World War II begins in Europe on September the 1st, 1939, with Hitler's invasion of Poland. Employing a military tactic now known as Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, German forces utilized fast moving tanks, artillery, and aircraft, which quickly overwhelmed the Polish defenses. In fact, Poland fell to the Nazis within weeks, illustrating the effectiveness of Germany's military strategy. In response, Britain and France declared war on Germany on September the 3rd, 1939, marking the official start of World War II in Europe. Note that World War II had actually begun in Asia about 8 years earlier with Japan's invasion of Manchuria in China. Now, at this point, though, the United States had a policy of strict neutrality, reflecting strong isolation sentiment that had honestly been in place since the end of World War I. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was personally sympathetic to the Allied cause, particularly Great Britain, publicly reinforced American neutrality. He navigated between supporting Democratic allies, but also trying to appease isolationist sentiments at home, which were still strong. Despite official neutrality, though, the US gradually began to provide economic support to Britain and allies through a policy called cash and carry, which was enacted in 1939. I'll talk about that more right now, in fact. So there were essentially two policies that took place that allowed the United States to help out its European allies without actually being involved in the war. As I mentioned before, cash and carry allowed allied countries, okay, so we're talking about France, Great Britain, so on and so forth, to buy arms and supplies if they paid for those supplies immediately and transported the goods themselves. Roosevelt saw this policy as a way that he could aid the Allies without engaging the US directly in the conflict. America's gradual pivot away from pure neutrality laid the groundwork for deeper involvement. The US made a much more decisive step towards supporting the Allies in March of 1941, when Roosevelt pushed Congress to pass the groundbreaking Lend Lease Act. This dramatically escalated United States aid to Britain and other allied nations, including actually the Soviet Union after June 1941 when Germany invaded. Under Lend Lease, America sent billions of dollars worth of weapons, vehicles, aircraft, and supplies to sustain Britain's survival and bolster the Allies' resistance to the Axis powers' aggression. Roosevelt famously explained the policy as akin to, quote, lending your neighbor a garden hose when their house is on fire, end quote, symbolizing America's indirect but crucial role in supporting the Allies further. By late 1941, America's commitment to aiding the Allies had grown increasingly visible. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill drafted the Atlantic Charter in August of that year, outlining common democratic principles and post war aims, even though the U.S. remained officially neutral. The U.S. Navy also began escorting British convoys in the North Atlantic, engaging German submarines on several occasions in undeclared naval conflicts, pushing America closer toward direct involvement in what was increasingly a global war. The course of the war changed dramatically on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese launched a surprise military attack against the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. They had planned for this for months and severely damaged or destroyed numerous battleships, cruisers, aircraft carriers, and killed approximately 2,400 Americans, devastating temporarily the United States Pacific Fleet. This shocking attack galvanized public opinion in America, which overnight transformed isolationist sentiment in the United States into a unanimous demand for action. President Roosevelt addressed the nation the next day in his famous infamy speech, calling December 7th, quote, a date which will live in infamy, end quote. Congress swiftly declared war on Japan on that very day, in fact, December 8th, 1941. The attack dramatically shifted the United States from cautious support of allies into full wartime mobilization, marking a turning point not just for the United States, but also dramatically reshaping the entire global conflict. Following America's declaration of war against Japan, it was actually Germany and Italy that declared war on the United States on December 11th. Interestingly enough, throughout the entire war, the United States never declared war on Nazi Germany. In fact, only recognizing a state of war that existed between the two powers. Regardless, with these declarations, the United States officially became a combatant in World War II. Now, the scale of American mobilization was unprecedented, transforming the entire economy to wartime production. Factories converted from producing civilian goods to manufacturing tanks, aircraft, ships, and weapons at unbelievable speed. Millions of Americans entered the workforce, including women, in unprecedented numbers. This industrial might, once fully mobilized, was a decisive advantage that the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan simply were unable to match. In the Pacific theater, American forces confronted Japanese expansion aggressively in several critical battles, most important of which was the Battle of Midway, fought in June of 1942. This was a decisive United States naval victory, which significantly weakened Japan's carrier fleet and importantly, a carrier fleet that Japan, unlike the United States, was simply unable to restore. America's industrial might was something that neither power was able to effectively counter. And truly, once the United States entered World War II, many historians have been able to argue since that the Allied victory was all but certain. In Europe and North Africa, American forces initially faced setback as inexperienced troops encountered battle hardened Axis armies. However, through determined effort and cooperation with British forces, American soldiers quickly gained experience. The combined Allied victory in North Africa, which is called Operation Torch, fought between November 1942 and May 1943, eventually was able to expel Axis power from the region and set the stage for invasions into southern Europe, demonstrating America's increasing effectiveness in the war and resolve in these combatants. Now, on June the 6th, 1944, Allied forces led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who will become president after the war, executed Operation Overlord, the D Day invasion of Normandy, France. This was the most ambitious amphibious assault in the history of mankind, involving 156,000 troops landing on heavily fortified beaches. Despite intense German resistance and high casualties, American forces secured a critical beachhead and established a foothold for the liberation of Western Europe. By late 1944, American troops reached the borders of Germany itself. Germany did launch one last desperate offensive in the Battle of the Bulge, catching U.S. forces off guard in December 1944. But despite some initial setbacks, American resilience and strategic leadership turned this engagement to a decisive victory. And quite frankly, the collapse of Nazi Germany was all but secured from then on. By early 1945, Allied armies advanced rapidly into Germany from the west, and Soviet forces approached from the east. American troops uncovered concentration camps, exposing the extent of Nazi atrocities and providing haunting evidence of genocide, deeply affecting public consciousness and shaping post war moral commitments. Germany executed its unconditional surrender on May the 8th, 1945, which is referred to as VE Day or Victory in Europe Day, marking the victory of the Allies. In the Pacific, of course, the war would continue for a period of time. After several costly battles on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and facing the prospect of enormous casualties, new American President Harry S. Truman, who took over after the death of FDR, authorized the use of atomic weapons to compel Japan's surrender. These were utilized on August 6th and August 9th, 1945, and are the first time and only time in actually world history that nuclear weapons have been used in the course of a military combat. They dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to devastating casualties and hastening Japan's surrender, which ultimately came only 6 days later on August the 15th, 1945, which is referred to as VJ Day or Victory over Japan Day. This surrender ceremony took place on September the 2nd, 1940. 1945 and marked the official ending of the Second World War. Immediately after the Second World War, the United States became, alongside the Soviet Union, one of the two superpowers remaining. Germany, Britain, and France were all devastated, and Japan, obviously a shadow of its former self. The US sought to transform the New World Order in two ways: founding the United Nations as an attempt to try to prevent future world wars from happening. However, as I'll discuss in the Cold War, there were several problems baked into the conception of the UN that make it relatively ineffective, even still today. The other thing the United States did under Harry Truman was the Marshall Plan, a commitment to spend millions of US dollars paid for by US taxpayers to rebuild Europe in a way that would make it much, much less likely that fascist powers like Germany, Italy could rise again, and providing security for Europe that lasted actually up until the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine.